My name is Doug Downs.
And my name is Fazana Badjual. Our guest this week is Mark Burey, joining all the way from London. Hi, Mark.
Hi, thank you for having me on.
How are things in London?
Yeah, I'm unseasonably sticky and toasty at the moment in London, but
Hot.
we're handling it. Yeah,
So
who would
Londoners
have
can
thought?
handle the heat. Great,
Well,
great.
as best we can.
Is this the one week of the year that the heat comes? This is it. After this, it's back to
Yeah,
the
it's
cloud.
everything goes into this week. Barbecues are out, everything.
Now, Mark, I have known you for years and I've always followed your journey. And we met when you were working with Alan Turing Institute. And we always had the most fascinating conversations about AI. And you're a seasoned communicator, background that spans journalism, public relations, senior leadership across education and technology sectors. And I always say that I sometimes find them the best PRs have a journalist background. And it's, and I think, Doug, you also have a journalist background.
15 years slogging it out.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's really interesting the sort of the unique approach to PR that those with a journalist background have, and I've always been sort of in a huge admiration for them. Now, you're now in the education space, and you're focused on a number of topics that we all find really interesting and relevant. So, about literacy and trust and media and how they intersect, and particularly for the next generation.
Absolutely. And I like that the evolution from journalist to public relations professional is we're going to tell them some things and eventually we learn, now maybe we should, talk to them and figure out what it is they want us to do and to tell them and all that. It's just like a backwards evolution of humanity. Mark, let me start by asking you, what does media literacy mean in 2025? And who's
Yeah,
supposed to be doing this now that the so-called traditional gatekeepers have faded away into nothingness?
great question. I think media literacy is a really kind of hot topic. It's something that's kind of constantly evolving. So I think, when I was younger, media literacy effectively meant the way in which you kind of receive and analyze, news and broadcasting and how you receive that information and your ability to kind of digest and question or not question that information. But I think now media literacy also embraces those kind of those newer media. Everything from kind of content curation should be in there in terms of media literacy. So it's a really kind of wide and increasingly complex space. I think for younger people, media literacy can be really challenging because I think one of the things that younger people are particularly facing at the moment, which we didn't necessarily have um, when we were younger, is just the sheer volume of content that's being created. So I think with that creates its own questions and challenges for young people. It's hard to take a step back and digest and dissect content when you're being constantly fed usually short snippets of content. Whereas, if you go back kind of 10, 15 years, a lot of that content was a longer form, kind of more digestible. You had more of an opportunity to take a step back and think about what it meant for you. Is it accurate? Are the questions for me? So, I think the whole question of media literacy has really, really changed.
And it's so important because when I think about the way that we were brought up, all of the content that we consumed were actually made by adults and they were made for children. But because they were made by adults, they always thought about the educational value as well as the entertainment. So Sesame Street would have child psychologists, for instance, and so forth. But then now what you're having is you've got this generation that are coming up where they're actually not consuming content that has been made for them by adults. They're actually consuming content that has been made by their peers. And so the intent for education through content production isn't there. So they're consuming something different. So I had a lot of fun with Grouch and all of the characters in Sesame Street, and the Count, learning how to count. And, there's a lot of like these sort of knowledge that was kind of packaged up in these cartoon characters that we all sort of consumed. And but that's not there. So there is a huge shift that's happening with this generation. Now, I also wanted to talk a little bit about local journalism because, when you're a student and you want to learn about media literacy, often they would write for their school newspaper, then they would get this amazing buzz and this rush if one of their articles made it to the local paper. Now, in a world without strong local journalism, how do you feel that's going to sort of impact in terms of not only public accountability for local communities, but also young people as well, that they don't have that segue, especially those who want to go into journalism? It often was like an initial, sort of playing ground for those who wanted to then go on to sort of national journalism. How do you feel that's impacting us, just the decline of local journalism and affecting communities
Yeah,
as well?
yeah, that's a really interesting point. I think, one of the things that has become more and more apparent is that with the kind of withering away of local journalism, that actually the role of PRs has changed considerably. If I think about my kind of first role in PR and communications, which was a local government role, really, I probably learnt the most I did because the level of scrutiny from local journalists was so intense. Their understanding of issues, of decision making, of the history of a local community was so forensic that it meant that as a PR person, you really had to up your game to understand and anticipate what their questions might be, and also build and nurture relationships with them. And a lot of that isn't there anymore. And so as PRs, I think, PR, I think, has assumed a little bit of that responsibility in terms of, I think, the role of senior leaders in encouraging organizational leaders, CEOs, to be, I guess, a bit more forthcoming with information, embracing local communities, being willing to be kind of transparent about decisions that they might be making, to consult more widely with communities. And then to the second part of the question, Fasana, um, yeah, it's not really there as a pathway for young people, that kind of traditional local journalism route, and then perhaps through to a stint in a national newspaper or in a national broadcaster. That's not really the route now. But what I would say for many of the younger people that I interview for roles, or that I uh, try to support or mentor, actually they get a lot of their learning, and it's a different type of learning, from working in their own spaces, in their bedroom, creating content, thinking about what works, learning editing skills, picking up skills around AI, embracing creativity in different kinds of ways. And actually, although they don't necessarily have those kind of core journalistic skills, their ability to create content is, I think, is certainly outstrips where young people would have been, say, 20, 25 years ago. The kind of
Mm.
readiness to create journalistic content is high.
Mark, I want to talk to you about misinformation. I won't go so far as disinformation. That has somewhat malevolent tone to it, but just the misinformed people that think they know something about something, and they don't know enough about that something. And let me ask this in the long form, which I'm sure everyone appreciates. I umpire baseball on the weekends. Baseball has a lot of rules. I don't know if you've noticed at all. There's a lot of rules. Best description I've ever heard is it's a game where 80% of the time we're using 20% of the rules, and then 20% of the time we suddenly use 80% of the rules, and people don't know nothing about beyond the 20%. And you can have confrontations with coaches who've seen something on TV, or parents that are, you don't confront a parent, but you hear it from parents who've seen something on TV. Or there's this myth about, oh, they were in the batter's box, so they're protected. And that's a complete myth. It doesn't exist. But people will latch on to something. When you're misinformed, it's not just you, I didn't know that. It's, what if you tell me something that goes against what I already know, then I'm going to entrench myself and dig deeply. So, how do we as PR pros speak to those who are misinformed, more willing to entrench on the things that they're misinformed by without sounding condescending, especially when we all have our own facts?
I think one of the things we've kind of all come to realize is that facts are really very much down to people's interpretation a lot of the time. And so I think one of the ways in which PRs can try to, I guess, navigate a very difficult space is rather than presenting back the facts as they see them, is raising questions about perhaps things that have been presented to them. So if
Appreciative
somebody,
inquiry.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly,
Yeah.
precisely. So it's more about taking the dialogue into a space that might be grounded in facts than stating those facts as you see them, because as you've alluded to, that only creates more and more confrontation. And and I think one of the advantages of newer and emerging media and channels and platforms like podcasts is they do allow for that inquiry and questioning, and um, there's no need to necessarily be so entrenched if you've got 30, 45 minutes to discuss a particular theme. Whereas if you're coming in to do a radio interview for 2 or 3 minutes, actually, you probably just want to get your facts out as cold and as quickly as you want to.
Can I follow up on that just quickly? How important then is trust? And is that it? Is that really the world we're in right now, that trust is the currency?
Yeah, absolutely. I think again, speaking as a PR professional, um, in a way, I think PR's kind of come back in a sense to its original purpose. That kind of building of long form relationships, building up trust with publics and stakeholders, thinking about how those relationships can nurture and improve an organization. That's the kind of core and crux of what good PR is. I think, rightly or wrongly, for a time, there was a real push towards that kind of bigger singular impact, attention grabbing type of PR and comms. And of course, there's a time and a place for doing that, and that's that has its own value clearly. But the cause of PR really is about relationship building in essence, and you can only do that through building up trust and building up relationships where people feel they can rely upon one another.
I love that. Mark, before your current role at working in education, you were head of comms for the Alan Turing Institute. And for those of our listeners who haven't come across them, they're the UK's National Centre for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence. They're around about 10 years old. And Mark, you started working with them in 2019, so well before ChatGPT came and transformed our lives, our working lives. I wanted to ask, did you see it coming? Because you were working obviously at the Alan Turing Institute. Did you see sort of ChatGPT, these sort of large language models, Perplexity, and all these other sort of tools coming into play? And being a comms professional, did you see the potential of how it would impact our industry? And if you could just share insight, because so many people who are tuning in and listening to us speak, their lives, their working lives are being impacted by AI, and they're asking themselves questions. They're asking, is AI a friend or is it a foe? Is it a mixture of both? How will it help me? How will it harm me? What else is there left so that I don't feel blindsided? So just pulling from your reservoir of experience and exposure whilst you're working at the Alan Turing Institute, what can you share with the audience about AI and our working lives as comms professionals?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I've learned at the Alan Turing Institute on reflection is that it's very hard to see it coming. I was fortunate to work with some uh, fantastic brains, some brilliant scientists who really appreciate and understand the kind of nuances of AI. Um, but actually, for many who are deeply entrenched in the science behind AI, for them, there's always a note of caution around what may or may not emerge. And actually, that was very much embedded into our communication strategy, trying to act as that kind of voice of reason, because I mean, I think we can all know and appreciate that there's a great deal of hype and um, yeah, a great deal of hype around AI. So actually, I think from a kind of professional point of view, I didn't necessarily appreciate how quickly and rapidly things would change, because part of my role was actually trying to manage people's expectations, and perhaps on reflection, they were managed too much. And actually, I think with things like Chat GPT, it's changed things so remarkably and so rapidly for people working in a whole plethora of industries in a way that I don't think anybody could have anticipated. So I think, yeah, I think with these things, it's very hard to anticipate what will happen next. And I think that breeds a certain amount of kind of nervousness for people who are working at a certain level within, whether it's AI or communications. And then, of course, in terms of embedding and using AI in my role, again, I've seen some rapid changes in terms of it being used as a real creative device, but clearly there's reasons to be cautious and concerned potentially about some of the applications. And I think, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot with my team recently is at what point do you embrace AI? At what point is it helpful in the kind of journey from the kicking off of a new project through to the delivery of that project? Because I think there can be some benefits or drawbacks depending on when you kind of use that tool to support you and how you use that tool. Sometimes the benefits can be scaling up, but sometimes actually creativity potentially might be stifled by bringing in certain AI tools too quickly in a way that then kind of forces you down a well-established and well-trodden track.
That's really interesting. There was this article in Time magazine that I read a couple of days ago, and it was based upon some research that was carried out on a group of people, those who are using Google search to write an essay, or ChatGPT, or nothing at all. And they assessed the work product, but they also assessed the brain levels of activity. And it wasn't good for
Mm,
ChatGPT, because it sort of showed that the work was soulless and generic, and it also sort of lowered the brain activity. Whereas Google search actually was quite good, because you're actively searching for things, and then obviously without it had the highest level of sort of critical reasoning and critical thinking. So it is really interesting with AI, but I think all teams such as yours, Mark, and mine and Doug's, we're rewriting our SOPs, our standard operating processes, because we have to now integrate sort of these AI. And actually, with this research that's coming out, it's probably not like don't use it or use it. It's probably actually, why, before you're writing, I don't know, a blog or whatever, why don't you do the Google search? Or why don't
mm.
you first think about the outline of what the blog is? Then why don't you do Google research to go and sort of read some relevant articles? And then the third step is you then give it, the mother of all prompts, from an informed perspective. And
Yeah.
so it's kind of, I think AI is fascinating, and I think we're just scratching at the moment.
And it's not a new tech, but another new piece of arsenal that we have as PR pros is podcasts, and sort of burst to the forefront with the U.S. election. Podcasts have been around close to 20 years now, but are podcasts the new discussion point? Are they sort of the new town hall, the place where people can go deep on a conversation? Farzana and I, in our last episode, we took opposing sides on a controversial topic. Not, and I, well, Farzana did believe in hers. I sort of quasi believe in my argument, but we had rhetoric. Is it a place where rhetoric can exist, and is that a pathway forward for us as a species?
Yeah, I think podcasts have been a real breakthrough. I kind of grew up as a young person who listened a lot to kind of talk and news radio, and really kind of appreciated that space for informed dialogue. And seeing podcasts grow has been really eye opening for me. I think it's been a brilliant development. I think it's a space where people can have complex conversations, can take opposing views in a really, really healthy way. It also gives people who wouldn't necessarily get an opportunity to share their views or their stories a new space and a new opportunity to do so. So, you obviously, as I'm sure you'll appreciate and understand, but there's such a range of podcasts, and some of the topic areas are incredibly niche, and
Yeah,
you
like
just
nail
wouldn't.
clipping for
Yeah,
seniors, right? Yeah, yeah.
exactly. There really is something for everyone, and and I think that's a really good thing because it kind of democratizes media in a way that wasn't there before. Radio can only do a certain thing in a certain way. Other forms of media, the dialogue is perhaps too truncated to get to the level of depth that you might want in a particular subject. So I think podcasts have been, yeah, a really, really healthy development on the whole, obviously with some caveats, but on the whole, I'm a big fan.
Awesome. Mark, so thanks so much for your time today.
My pleasure.